When there's less local news, people in general feel more alienated from their communities. And if you're feeling ineffective and alienated, then you're also going to feel nihilistic and not bother to vote.
Local news matters. I know a lot of you guys are thinking, local news was never good, and the newspapers look like teeny tiny little tabloids now. And it's true, but at least the politicians knew someone was watching. Now there's more than 1,000 news deserts in America, meaning no reliable local news telling you where your tax money spent, who polluted the water, which politicians are lying. And there's so many studies that say a decline in local news increases corruption and wasteful spending. You get more radical politicians. They just watch the national news for talking points, and the people vote less. They think their vote doesn't matter. The real news is still trapped behind a paywall, and still 71% of Americans don't even know that their local news is disappearing. Well, now you know. Stay tuned. Steve, maybe you could give us a little bit of background and overview about the gravity of this crisis and where you're seeing local news solutions and why you've sort of dedicated your life to this.
Well, you had just a great summary, and you're right. You know, most people, when you talk to them talk about like a collapse of local news, they look at you like, "What are you talking about? Collapse of news? I'm flooded with news. There's news everywhere." You know, it doesn't feel like we're in a shortage of news moment, but while there's an abundance of national news and social media, there is actually an extreme shortage of local reporting. And it's just as a point of comparison, there's been a 60% drop in the number of reporters just in about 15 years. That's an incredibly sudden, dramatic contraction. And as you said, in addition to that, there are all these thousands of news deserts where there's nothing going on. And then there's another several thousand that are, there's a term of art called ghost newspapers. And that's basically like newspaper. They're still publishing. There's still pieces of paper with words on them and websites, but the level of local coverage is, there's a study that showed that 17% of the articles in a local newspaper are local. And that just gives you a sense, like, it's just evaporating in a lot of places. And as you said, more corruption, lower voter turnout, higher taxes, more pollution, like that's all true. That all is associated with what happens when you have less local news. So the vacuums are being filled, and they're being filled by national media that's more polarizing, by social media, by misinformation. So it's all, in other words, the collapse of local news is also connected to this other set of problems that I know you've talked about in other contexts of misinformation and polarization and things like that.
Maybe you could give an example of something that like wouldn't be covered now that would have been covered if local news was there, and how that really could affect Americans.
Whether the schools have decided to, close a bunch of schools or spend less money on special education, or where the COVID testing areas are, or whether the mayor is actually doing what she said she was going to do. There's a famous example in California that is kind of an extreme version, but in Bell, California, where there was a community, working class community that had no newspaper. And since no one was showing up at the city council meetings, they just kept voting themselves pay raises, to the point where the city manager was getting paid $800,000 a year. And it wasn't illegal. It wasn't like, it wasn't done in on a parking garage, in stealth mode with people with trench coats. They were doing it at the city council meeting, but there was no one there. So it just got, and we don't really know all the examples like that are happening because there's no one there. So it's a little bit of we don't know what we don't know, but there's overwhelming evidence that from not just here, but around the world, that when you have this, it leads to more corruption, all the things you said.
Why exactly that connection between voting and local news engagement? How does that? It's because people just get nihilistic and say, this is just complete trash. Like, why do I even care? Is that the kind of reason for
That's a great question. I think some of it is even more pedestrian than that. It's just like, you don't hear about it. You don't hear about the election at all. There's nothing interesting or exciting about it because you don't even know it exists and you don't feel any investment. Or you may feel like, I don't know anything about any of these people. Wouldn't even know how to base my votes. That's one level. But I also think it's what you said, is that there certainly are studies, and this feels intuitively right, that says when there's less local news, people in general feel more alienated from their communities. They just feel ineffective. Like, I can't influence anything. That actually is connected to how much local news there is. And if you're feeling ineffective and alienated, then you're also going to feel nihilistic and not bother to vote.
It is so true that the whole political debate has become so nationalized, right? Like,
yeah.
It's like people are talking about these national issues, which a lot of times are these abstract issues that are not necessarily are going to affect your day to day. It's more like, this is how I identify with this side, I identify with that side.
Right. It's more what tribe are you in? And one other effect of that is, I think that when you're dealing with national issues, it's easier to demonize your opponents. It's easier to view them as cartoon characters because they're abstract. They're far away. They're in that community across the country that's doing crazy things. And it's not like local news isn't controversial. There's also, local news can be really controversial, but it's of a different sort because, first of all, you're seeing the person face to face. And that same person who you might be disagreeing with about the school board thing, you may be seeing them at the soccer match that Sunday, or you may be agreeing with them on a different issue because the issues don't fall on left, right, MAGA, non-MAGA, spectrum. So it can still be very controversial, but I think it tends to be, you're a little less likely to completely dehumanize your opponent and a little less likely to therefore become quite as vicious and polarized.
So it's more kind of something that you actually both care about, and you all kind of want your city to do better. You want your politicians to do better. You can all agree on that.
Filling potholes is not really a Democratic or Republican issue. And a lot of the issues that come up locally just kind of split along different lines than they would nationally. And I think often it's true that, like, people know that even the person who's disagreeing with you, they're doing it because they care about the community. Whereas on the national level, it's like you're the enemy. The people who disagree with you hate you, and they hate your country, and they, it's not like we all, want the same thing or the best for the country. Like, that seems to be gone. Like, now it's the people on the other side of this, are trying to destroy the country.
Maybe you could, like, really quickly before we move on, sort of, how did it get so bad in terms of the business model? People always say, they simplify and say, like, Craigslist came and destroyed local newspapers because they didn't have classifieds. Was it that simple, or what were all the factors?
That was kind of the first step. But even stepping back, the internet did break the local news business model, because the way I like to think about it is, in the olden days, which isn't that long, 15 years ago, advertisers supported local news because the way to reach your customer was to be next to local content. And now, if you're an advertiser, you can reach your customer all sorts of other ways. So initially, Craigslist was like the first example, but it wasn't just Craigslist. That early days of the internet, it was like Monster.com took away the job ads, Auto Trader took away the car ads, LinkedIn took little by little, each part of the business, the ad model of a newspaper got kind of picked off by different parts of the internet. And then Facebook and Google came along. and just accelerated basically the same phenomenon, that basically all these small businesses that used to, not small, all these local businesses that used to advertise in papers now don't. Like, that's just the heart of why the collapse. And this has led to an 81% drop in advertising revenue for local newspapers. 81%. In like less than 2 decades.
And they started, essentially, people call it a monopoly, right, on distribution. They were the only way you could really get in touch with that many people was through newspaper or TV on local stations. So they almost had a monopoly on it that supported quality journalism in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and that's why I don't tend to be, moralistic about the companies that came along, Craigslist or whatever. Like, you could argue, well, the newspapers were using their monopoly status to charge way more than they should have been, and Craigslist broke the monopoly, and so I don't think of it necessarily as a like the tobacco industry or something coming in and nefarious, but this is just the reality that this new world, the internet, it had all these great advantages, but this was a massive unintended consequence of the whole thing, was the destruction of the business model for local news.